Greetings, folks, and welcome once again to the Lessons from the Cockpit show. I am your host, Mark Hasara, and for over 60 years, my passion has been all things aviation. For 24 years, I flew the KC-135 as a pilot in the United States Air Force. On the Lessons from the Cockpit show, we interview some of the most compelling and riveting pilots, aircrew members, maintainers, and aviation enthusiasts from all over the world. The purpose of our show is to hear some of these great stories, but more importantly, the lessons learned from these people who have been in these intense and extraordinary military, commercial, and even private flying operations. This exploration gives our listeners practical advice on how the aviation world works and expands critical thinking skills both in the air and on the ground. Many of the stories that you're going to hear have never been told before, and you are hearing them first on Lessons from the Cockpit. Special thanks to Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar for sponsoring this episode of the show. In the show notes, there are links to Wall Pilot to buy the airplanes that we're going to talk about tonight. These vinyl art prints peel off so that you can stick them to your walls. And today, folks, we're going to talk to someone I've known for a very long time, but only met recently. On January 17th, 1991, John Boy Walton and I were flying together. Me in Tuna 6-4, he leading the first Wild Weasel package into Baghdad. And he's going to tell you about some of his missions during Operation Desert Storm. So, grab an adult beverage of your choice. Sit down, strap in, and let's begin the Lessons from the Cockpit show with Colonel George John Boy Walton. Welcome to the Lessons from the Cockpit show, John Boy. Thanks for being on with me today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
You've got such a great history and a great story to tell about being a Weasel pilot. And,
well, thanks for asking. I'm very happy to be here with you. We've been friends remotely for a very long time, and I wish we could get together sometime.
You know, we've got to do that next time I come out on the East Coast. If you plan to go skiing sometime, come out and see us. Of course, all the ski resorts are closed now, but yeah, we do need to get together. Folks, I want to tell you about one thing that John Boy invited me to, and that was the Desert Storm Weasel reunion. And we're going to talk about what wild weasels are and everything. And that was so much fun being on with all of your brothers that I was pumping gas into, and finally get to see some of the faces and hear some of the voices that I'd heard for so long ago.
Yeah. And
connecting with them. So tell all my listeners a little bit about your background.
I'm a Texas boy. I grew up in Texas. My family came from Texas. I think the first ones moved there in 1836, and my great-grandfather was born there the same year as the Alamo fell. I went to Texas A&M. I got a contract from the Air Force, went straight to pilot training. I was lucky enough to finish high enough in pilot training to get a fighter and go straight into Tactical Air Command. And I spent a wonderful 25 years flying fighters for the Air Force. And then they sent me off to Switzerland and made me fly some of their fighters as well. So that was a good finish to a great flying career.
Flying in Switzerland. Oh my gosh. Flying through the mountains of Switzerland and everything.
Scenery was to die for.
Oh, I'll bet it was, as was the food.
Actually, and my wife and I together over there, she has a food allergy to cheese. And so now we get stationed to the land of cheese.
Oh, but no.
At least I got my fix of cheese. I ate mine and then I ate hers. So it was a good deal.
All of you can't see this. On his wall is the F-4 Phantom. He flew F-4s.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, that piece of wood right there with the cartoon on it, that was on the front of our ops desk in Bahrain during Desert Shield. When we got there, we had a squadron cartoonist. His name was Kevin Hale. His call sign was Brinch. And I asked him, I drew a square on the ops desk and asked him to draw that. And then after he drew it, got everybody in the squadron to sign around it. And the arrival date is on the left, 17 August, 1990.
Yeah.
And we left the right side blank until we left there. He put in the departure date, 23 March of 91. That's when we left Bahrain. So that's our bookends. And that little piece of wood we cut out, brought home. The Smithsonian asked our squadron for some memorabilia, and I sent them this thing, and they put it on display during Desert Storm Welcome Home to the Troops thing for about 6 to 9 months.
Yeah.
And then they mailed it back to me, and the squadron gave it to me as a going away present. And I'm very proud of that piece of wood.
Oh, and you should be.
Yeah.
What an incredible, the 561st obviously is got a very rich history as Weasels, all the way back to Vietnam. Take a few moments and explain the history of the Wild Weasel mission and why it's so important, particularly during the Vietnam War, as that mission is just gestating. It's just coming about.
That's very true. The original problem in Vietnam in the late 60s, when people started flying north, the North Vietnamese had all of these Soviet surface-to-air missiles, all this equipment that was provided to them by the Russians as good stuff. In fact, it was too good. And every time our fighters and bombers and anybody else that went to the north went up there, they were getting shot down. So they created this, they had a detection equipment. It was a radar warning receiver set. And they, in the early infant stages of it, it was very basic. All it would do was basically tell you the azimuth of the threat. And you'd have to fly down that azimuth straight into wherever the threat was. The problem was the surface-to-air missiles knew you were coming, and so they'd shoot at you and shoot you out of the sky. And they originally did this in F-100s, a two-seat F-100. I think there was like a dozen airplanes on the initial cadre, and probably the same number, a few more pilots, and more than half of them got shot down in a very short amount of time trying to blow up surface-to-air missile sites in and around Hanoi in Vietnam, or in the North Vietnam. That started it. In fact, when they told one of the backseaters that this was what their mission was going to be, he looked very concerned, and he kind of raised his eyebrows and he says, "You got to be shitting me." And that YGBSM letter logo is on every one of our Wild Weasel hats. Anytime you see a Wild Weasel with YGBSM on it, that's where that came from the F-100 days.
From a great American by the name of Jack Donovan.
That's the guy.
Jack Donovan created that. You gotta be.
Yeah. And I thought it was kind of understated, but after the F-100s, they went a little bit more sophisticated in the F-105, which was a much more survivable airplane, a faster airplane, and they had better detection equipment, and they had better weapons. Weapons were improving, but it was still a very high-risk mission. In fact, General Horner, who was our air boss, if you remember over there, in fact, He was at our reunion a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
General Horner, Carolyn's getting home right now, and that's the dog barking.
The barking doorbell.
Anyway, he was Weasel number 333, so that's how far back he goes. I think I'm in the 2000s somewhere as far as Wild Weasels are concerned. The 105, better equipment, better airplane, but still not that survivable. They moved on to the F4. The early F4C tried the mission, but with very limited equipment, and the ordnance hadn't improved very much. Then they came up with the F-4G, which was dedicated to this mission. And they came up with a thing called the Standard Arm, the AGM-78, and they had Shrike missiles. They were still fairly limited in capability, but it was much improved over what they had previously in the F-105 and the F-4C. And then finally, about the time that Saddam Hussein decides that he wants to invade a country and declare it a 13th province, we had evolved in the Wild Weasel business to an excellent piece of equipment for detection and an excellent weapon called the AGM-88 HARM, which is legitimately an I wish you were dead missile. It senses things on the spectrum of radars, everything from AM on your radio dial to daylight, and it can target anywhere in between. If a target is up and stays up, this missile will guide on it and blow it away. It's the radars that we're going after, because once you blow the radars away, the missiles on the rail are essentially useless, and we've accomplished our mission, and the strike airplanes can come in and not get shot at. And that was the mission.
The HARM missile obviously had a pre-planned mode. There was like a target of opportunity mode, and it would just go after things.
And
I remember
it could also flex to another target. And there was a prioritization menu that was in the missile itself. And if the thing that you shot it at decided to turn itself off before it could actually get into range to actually come down there and blow it up, anything that shows up in its field of view that looks like it's a lucrative target, it could flex to that one and blow it up instead. And that happened a few times as well.
And HARM, standing for high-speed anti-radiation missile, it does it very quickly.
I'm good at acronyms. I'm terrible to remember to explain what they are. That's what a HARM is.
The ultimate in HARM for radar operators. And of course, it's got all these little tungsten steel cubes in it in its warhead. It's like a shotgun shell moving at 3 times the speed of sound. And it's a big missile too. Well,
it's bigger than the Shrike, but it's smaller than the old standard arm. Mm-hmm. But the range was fantastic. We could shoot that outside the range of most of the SAMs that were trying to shoot us, which was an advantage on our part. They could hold back turning on their radars until we were within range. And then it would be a test to see whose missile was faster, yours or mine. Fortunately, we had a very high speed answer to whatever it was that they were shooting at us. And if we could blow up their radar before the missile came anywhere near us, it would just go ballistic and not be a threat.
And George, if I remember right, the missile goes like up in altitude. It takes off and kind of does this hayaka up to X amount of thousands feet and kind of hangs out and watches for a lot of these things to open up.
That describes it fairly well. And the first night, frankly, I forgot that because we were pretty busy coming into Baghdad. We had everything was lined up and ready for us to go. I'm seeing all these threats out there, and some of the early Alchems, the air-launched cruise missiles, are starting to blow up downtown, and I can see all those explosions going off. And so radars are coming online, and magically our primary target on the northeast side of town came up. We went ahead and targeted that thing and let it go. And it's dark, right? Number one, I forgot to close my eyes. And number two, I forgot that the thing was going to G-bias into the vertical for the range.
Yeah.
And so my first impression is I'm blind. And my second impression is, we've got a wild rocket. And then I remember, no, it's just G-biasing. What it does is it goes into the ionosphere, and it's basically doing a big arc and coming down. And when it's on the downhill slide, the eyes open up and it's looking in a basket. And if it sees its primary target, it goes right onto that and straight for the target.
Oh, man. And that really has become the missile of choice now. And
it was then, and I think it still is.
Yeah. And we're up to, what were you shooting, like block 3s and 4s? And I think we're up to like block 8 or something like that now. And the missile has really improved. And you've talked about the opening night of Desert Storm. So let's go into that and how you and I met over a phone.
We did. There was a thing we referred to, I don't know what you guys call it. We call it the bat phone. And it was a standard military piece of equipment, OD green with a bunch of dials and stuff on the top. But there was a push button arrangement, sort of like a typewriter. And you could call any squadron in the theater with just 3 digits if you had the roster. And I think you called us, didn't you?
We did.
And I happened to be at the duty desk, and we got on the phone with each other. And I'm thinking, hey, we get to talk over the phone before we go do this thing. What a great idea.
Here's what happened to us, George. Buster, and I can't remember, and it's a different Buster. We had a Buster at Jeddah where our tankers were. And he comes down the hallway one day and he goes, hey, Mark, I need to talk to you and your crew. That's when he tells us, you've got a very important refueling mission. We're putting you on it because your crew has been here. Your crew is one of the crews that have been in theater the longest. you're going to refuel the first Wild Weasel package into Baghdad. And I'm like going, and I knew the Weasel mission and all the history behind it, because I build model airplanes, and the F-105 Wild Weasel was actually one of my favorite airplanes. It's just a beautiful, sleek airplane. And a matter of fact, they've got one up at Hill Aerospace Museum here, George, tail number 440 from the 17th Wild Weasel Squadron, the big shark mouth on the nose. I mean, it's really cool looking. And they've got a standard arm and a Shrike on it. They said, you've got the Weasel mission. And I go, okay. Knowing what we were going to do, I knew I needed to talk to you guys because I wanted to be on the same sheet of music you guys were on, knowing that SAC did their mission planning differently than TAC did. And I understood that back when I was a captain, particularly coming from Kadena, where we had all the F-15 squadrons. It's something I had learned. So I find out, okay, where are these guys? Oh, they're in Bahrain. Oh, here's their number. And I grabbed my navigator, Kevin Adelson, and I punched the numbers, and it rings, I think, 2 or 3 times. And then somebody picks it up.
That was me, actually. I was at the desk.
Yes.
Happened to be, in fact, I was expecting, we had a guy over in Riyadh, Beagle Keck was my guy. And we had just gone over call sign request. He calls me up and asks me, what do you guys want to use for call signs? And he turned down my first idea because there were some Vietnam call signs that I kind of thought would be a good thing to throw in there. He said, no, somebody's already got that. And I said, well, shoot, how about beers? Can we be beer call signs? And he says, geez, I don't know. Sure, why not? So we became Michelob, Budweiser, Coors. We hadn't had beers in like 4 months.
Why not?
We became the beer call signs. Well, I was expecting a call back from Beagle, and the phone rings. I answered it, and it was you. You said, I'm going to be your tanker. What was it, day after tomorrow?
Yeah.
And I said, oh, great. I wish I had Bud Redmond with me, but we talked again later, and I had Bud with me. Bud's my backseater. Bud Redmond was, bar none, I think the finest electronic warfare officer on the planet, and I was fortunate enough to make a command decision and put him in my pit when I first met him, and we stayed together through the entire war. Budman was the primary planner for all of the detail work, and so we got back together on the phone with him later on. But what we tried to make sure you understood was timing was extremely critical. We didn't want to be late, and the further we could get north without dropping off the tanker, the more gas we would have coming out of Baghdad, because gas was important, especially if you had to punch off external tanks. The more gas we had, the better for all of us. So we went through specific to the second planning, and you guys soaked it all up and said, no problem, we can do all of that. I've told you many times before, as far as I was concerned, the Gulf War could not have happened without tankers. And I even told you, I think the tanker guys won that war for us. So hats off to you.
You have said that to me several times. The second phone call was actually between my navigator and Bud.
I was there. I just listened in.
Yeah. And I remember handing Kevin the phone so that I could hear them talking and going through everything. I remember one very important piece from that night when we were talking on the phone too, George. You told me that we had to go through the high EW GCI line, the high early warning ground control intercept line at I think it was 3:05 in the morning, and you couldn't accept 10 seconds early or 20 seconds late. There was a 30-second window. I remember Kevin saying, yep, got it, no problem. He wrote all that stuff down. We already had our mission notes that we were writing all down and everything. I remember we talked about ground speed that you guys needed, all these different things to stay on your timing. I remember writing that down on my kneeboard and having all that information. And of course, we shared that with our number 2 and our number 3. We were Tuna 6-4 flight that night, 6-4, 6-5, and 6-6. And you were COORS, LONESTAR, and MICHELOB with Drill 7-1, 7-2, and 7-3, the F-111s that were with you also. I think that's one of these great business and life lessons is when you're doing business with your customer. And I looked at you, George, as a customer. You are my customer. I have to do the things that will help him be successful. And those 2 phone calls, I think, were what made us successful that night.
I think it made us friends for life, just because we had that opportunity to deal with you and make sure that you knew, hey, our butts were on the line here, and we did not want to be late, first off, and we didn't want to run out of gas. And the F4 sucks gas like nobody's business. It's a 4-hour mission. We knew that going in. It's 2 hours up and 2 hours back, and there had to be in-flight refueling before we went in, and there had to be in-flight refueling in order to make it home. Funny thing about all of the mission planning that we ever did was centered around where's the tanker, then we could get to our target. And we never went up to a tanker track and didn't find a tanker there waiting for us. It seemed like the gas stations in the sky were always there.
Amazing stuff. I don't know if I've told you this. I'd already seen Horner's message saying implement Wolfpack, had the time, date and time. And I think he signed it off like good luck and good hunting, Horner. I think that's all it said, if I remember right.
You know, they backed it up. The frag initially had us, I think our TOT initially was like 11 at night. Several days, it wasn't too many days before, they moved it back to, I think it was a little after 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
So they moved everything back 3 hours.
Yeah.
Which we didn't care about, but a lot of potential for screwing stuff up if everybody else in the theater didn't get the same word. And the fact that we could talk to you on the phone to make sure we all knew exactly what time we need, where, and when made a big difference.
Yep. Oh, didn't it though? I knew it was going to happen, but I couldn't tell my crew. I was working in our planning cell as well as flying missions. And Dave Wright said, hey, come with me. And he showed me that message from Horner saying, you know, implement Wolfpack D-Day, 17 January, first TOT, H hour, you know, like you said, those 2 o'clock in the morning. And I remember holding that in my hands thinking, wow, this is so cool seeing this. And we finally got the phone call, got alerted. Okay, come in. We're going to have the big mass brief at 10 o'clock at night. Our wing commander was from the Topeka Guard, Nick Byer, and he gets up. Okay, tonight you're going to make history. Here we go. It's starting tonight, you know, and a lot of nervousness in the crowd and everything, because Strategic Air Command had a team that came over, George, and I don't know if I've told you this either. They came over and they said, look to the left of you, look to the right of you. One of you is not going to be here at the end of the war. 10% of you are going to be gone. And we're all like going, wait, what? But my crew coming from Kadena, knowing how F-15s operated, we knew that we would be the most overprotected people out there. But I'll never forget that takeoff that night, George, in our old water wagons, starting the water, all three of us taking off and flying underneath Peach and Nighthawk, which was the F-117 track, and then coming to you. But you know what? You had a very distinctive voice. And even though we didn't talk a lot that night, and we'll get to the one thing you said here in just a minute.
Yeah. I was embarrassed about that. Okay. I told you we're calm out and we're not going to say a word. And I was always a big fan of the less you have to say, the better. Yeah. And it really bothered me because you guys, I said the word turn. Let me preface all of this by explaining. We had found you in the desert, somewhere in Saudi Arabia. Yeah. My 4-ship gets behind you. The next 4-ship gets behind, I think you're number 2. Yep. And the third tanker had the EF-111s. 4-ship was on your number 3. Yeah. And then the EF-111s came in. Yeah. There was there was you guys, all 4 of you, and then an EF-111 on each of us. Nobody's saying anything, and we didn't have to. We get up behind, the guy starts pumping gas, 2, 3, and 4 in order, starts taking gas. We're headed away from Baghdad, and I'm looking at the digital meter that's telling me what my ETA to this jump off point is, and it's cranking down to 0. And I actually looked at it about 2 seconds prior to 0, and I said on the radio one word. I said turn. And then I look up and you were already starting the turn. And I feel bad that I said it. I'm over it now, but at the time I really had a lot of guilt because I said the first words of the Gulf War, and the first word was turn. And you turned us around. Yeah. And we headed north, and the ETA meter was happy. The estimated time of arrival meter was happy. We made our jump off actually a little ahead of time because you guys kept us on the boom, flew us north, and actually pushed it up a little faster than we probably should have been. But it's, there's a war on, so who cares? And we went faster. And
so inside my cockpit, Kevin Adelson, my navigator, was telling me, okay, get ready. We're going to make a turn here soon. Of course, he's sitting behind me and he goes, hey, pilot, it's time. And I look back and I saw him go like this with his hand. And that's when I reached down with the turn knob and started that lazy turn back to the north. All right. And just as I'd started that, I heard your voice go, turn. And Kevin looked up at me and all he did was this. He just said, he goes, thumbs up like that, confirming that we were right where we wanted to be on timing.
Yeah.
Right where we wanted.
So apologies, but good on you, man.
And no, there's no apologies you don't need to apologize to me, brother, because again, that was a great thing that you did, in my opinion, because it meant that we were all on the same sheet of music. All of us were exactly thinking the same. And that was confirmation of that to me. And that was one of the great things of the war, was hearing you and Kevin at this very same time. Okay, let's do it. We're heading north now. No apologies necessary, brother.
And since we're recording this for history, we're headed north and we're still on the boom and still taking gas. And I know we just left the refueling track and we're still on the boom and we're still headed north. And we went a lot further north than you guys had to. I'm not sure how close to the border you got. We had a ton more gas, probably literally a ton more gas per airplane than we really needed. And it really helped out a lot. So thanks for that.
And we're happy to do it because, again, you are our customer and that's the way we're supposed to handle that. But remember, your number 4 guy had problems getting gas. We got to the NDR point and my crew looked at me and I said, we're going to keep going. We're just going to keep going. They'll tell us when they're ready to hop off the boom.
That was Buff. Buff was, Kurt Atenzio was the guy in number 4. Mm-hmm. And he never said a word. I'm not real sure what the problem was. I think it was in his nozzle. It was his nozzle, not our nozzle. Not the boomer. And the boomer kept trying to plug it in. He would plug it in eventually and had pressure the boom into the nozzle and allow the gas to flow that way. Probably spilled a lot too. Nobody said anything because nobody wanted to cry uncle and go home. Later on, we got the airplane fixed, so he was fine. He could fly fine, and he was in position. He just couldn't quite get the gas that he needed.
It was a system error because my boom operator Rick Brack, who I'm still in touch with, lives down in Florida. He kept plugging him. It wouldn't hold for some reason.
It wouldn't lock.
It wouldn't lock. And then finally, he just says, "Okay, here we go," and he just went wham. All right, and sure enough, boom, it locked.
Yeah,
and there was one other thing that we always asked the crew chief when we were refueling F4s, George. I don't know if you knew this. One of the first questions I asked Vonnie Peterson, little red-haired gal that was the crew chief for my airplane 8019 that night. She was a fantastic crew chief. I told her we were doing F4s. I always asked when we were doing F4s, is the nozzle greased? Because that was the one thing that helped us connect with the F4s. And of course, she had slapped a whole bunch of it on there. So I knew it wasn't us. I knew it was in his airplane.
Yeah.
But we finally got hooked up with Atenzio, like right at the NDR point. And I just said, we're going to keep going until we get a pressure disconnect. And sure enough, a few minutes later, Rick Brack screams over the interphone, "Hey, we got a pressure disconnect. He's got his gas. All of a sudden, everybody's forming out on the wings. We're still moving forward. And my nav is telling me, "Mark, pilot, we're real close to the border." And I said, "Okay, whatever." And I remember all of you guys dropping down, and I remember you waving at me out the left window.
I'm surprised you could see.
You know what? That was one thing I could see, because it was so dark that night, but I remember seeing your hand come up, wave like that, and you disappeared underneath us. And I said, okay, well, we got to keep going forward because I don't know what's happening behind me. We're not talking. And my co-pilot looked out and saw your COORS LONESTAR coming up behind us. And I said, okay, everybody's got gas. And you disappeared under the nose came out in front of me, maybe about a mile and a half, with the EF-111 going from right to left. And remember, George, there was that overcast cloud layer right at the border that night.
Yep.
I remember that very distinctly. And all of a sudden your lights go out and your slime lights come up and everything. I'm like going, ooh, we're real close. But hey, we did what we were supposed to do. We did what we were supposed to do.
If you were still with us and saw our lights go off, you went inside Saudi Arabia, or went inside Iraq, because we fenced just inside Iraq. By fence, I mean, we set all our switches up, which means lights, external
fence
lights
check,
go off.
the fence check.
Yeah. Anyway, we didn't do that till we were past the Iraq border coming in. So you guys were either on or past the Saudi-Iraq border when you turned around.
Kevin said we were like within 2 miles, I think is what it was. But, you guys were marching off in front of us, and we dropped you off full of gas and just a little bit early. Because I told him, I says, we want to drop them off a little bit early so that they've got some cushion that they can play with when they start doing all this. Because remember, that
allowed us to find out how fast an F-4 could go in full 100% military power and not have to worry about how much gas you're eating. Those 3 external tanks, you suck gas fairly quickly because of all the drag. And if you're in military, we didn't go to afterburner because afterburner would highlight you for the world.
Yeah.
But we were as far forward on the throttle as we could go without going into afterburner. We raced into Baghdad that night like that with no problems at all. Plenty of gas coming out.
Yeah.
And again, thanks to you guys.
And of course, the takedown of Baghdad's integrated air defense system was a big plan because we had people coming, the Navy coming, we had the drones that were going in, everything. Blaine, this is the first chapter in the book, and I called it Drinks for Pooh Bah's Party for a reason, because Pooh Bah, Larry Henry created this elaborate plan. Maybe you can talk about that for just a little bit.
Yeah, I was really sorry when Larry Henry had to leave the theater early. He was one of the 105 EWOs that we talked about earlier. The history behind Pooh Bah is fairly amazing. I think he needs to write a few books himself. And he's still alive and well in just outside of San Antonio. The overall plan for this thing was to lead everybody in, go in there ahead of the primary strike packages and blow away as many radars that were associated with surface-to-air missiles as we possibly could. My initial package, I was supposed to have 16 airplanes in the original Desert Storm frag that we got back in early September, which would have been most of my squadron at the time. But then we got more airplanes, and then we had more targeting. They basically retargeted a lot of folks to the Kuwait theater, and some even out to the H2, H3 area. And between us, the 561st and the 81st, we had a lot of F-4Gs headed north going into Iraq and Kuwait, just leading the packages on in. Now, the 117s, those guys, I'm not real sure about the timing. I do know the Alchemist went off. They had three F-117s targeting downtown. Each of them had 2 of those
bunker buster
2,000 pound,
the
2,000 pound bombs. And they were each targeted on specific targets. So it's, a total of 6 bombs.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure, my Bud Redmond tells me we have them on radar because you can see them better from the back than you can from the front. They took the altitudes that we wanted to have because we wanted a happy medium between low enough to be able to max perform the airplane, but high enough to stay out of the real time zone of the bullets. That's exactly where they wanted to be, and they got priority. So that's where they were. And we were in the next block above them racing in. And either they were up ahead of us or we blew past them as we went into Baghdad. I can't really see anybody. I know we were going very fast, so we may have passed them up coming into town. We ended up with only 12 because of the retasking going into Baghdad the first night, and that's 24 harms. And when we reviewed the tapes when we got back out of the 24 harms, I think Bud was telling me that he was sure that at least 16 of them guided to the correct targets and took them out.
Wow.
And of the remaining 8, he was not sure about maybe 4 or 5 And the others, the remainder, probably got their target, but we couldn't quite verify it.
Yeah.
So we did a pretty good job of saturating the surface to air threats in and around Baghdad the first night. And there was a follow-up wave that happened just a few hours later, and they were doing exactly the same thing. And those guys had it a lot tougher than we did because we were the ones that basically whacked the hornet's nest, and they're mad now. And so the next wave had to come in. They're shooting at anything that moves. Problem is, we had that great weapon, the harm that we could stand off with and shoot from a distance, and they could shoot their missiles all they wanted. We were out of range, and they were confused, and that was a good thing, keeping them confused.
The other thing I remember from that night was just shortly after passing through that IEW GCI line, the Task Force Normandy helicopters guys had started stirring everything up, and now MiGs are launching. And if I remember you telling me right, you had something coming after you.
Well, going in, we saw what we knew were a couple of MiG-29s that popped up. Bud's telling me it was two of them, so I'll have to trust what he tells me. And they flew up, and then they flew north and ran away. So they were never a threat for us.
Yeah.
But when we came out of Baghdad, after we got our second harm off, turned south to our egress point, and I'm trying to remember the name of the airport. There's an airport, a Iraqi airport just southeast of the city, and one of our egress points is close by there.
Was that Medicis?
No, it was I want to say Al-Jabbar, but it wasn't Al-Jabbar.
Yeah.
I'll remember the name later.
Okay.
It's been 30 plus years.
Yeah.
Anyway, as we're headed south, Bud tells me that he's got this contact on the nose at about 20 miles, and he's coming right at us. And he immediately figures out that it is a bad guy. In fact, we knew fairly quickly that it was a Mirage F1. My first thought was, this guy's got a lot of guts. Not only is he out here by himself, he's poking his nose into this fur ball like he wants to play. And so Bud locks him up, and I'm looking at him, and I'm just about ready to turn in, meet him head on, and shoot an AIM-7 at him. He was about 3 miles off my left 11 o'clock, co-altitude, and then he turns into a fireball. As it turns out, an F-15 Tate, Steve Tate, was coming up from behind this guy, and he was about 10 miles, 10 miles from the rear. And the only reason the guy came into range for his AIM-7 distant shot from the stern was because he started to turn into me, and that shrinks the distance for the missile to have to travel. Yep. And just as he's starting to turn in to convert on us, the missile catches up with him, and boom, fireball.
Yeah.
So we got a little bit of extra fireworks on our way out.
When I turn around, I tell my crew, we're going to push it up. We're going to get the airplane back because we want to turn the airplane, obviously. Get it full of gas so get ready for another mission. But I remember telling my guys, let's get back because this is going to be on CNN. And we get back and we're sitting there watching CNN. We've only had the TV on for 5 minutes. And guess who shows up on CNN? Go ahead and tell that story.
Let me tell you, Ron Karp, our wing commander, that afternoon before we went out that night, he corners me and he says, we got the media pool is here in our compound at Fort Apache. We had a compound there that was all where the squadron guys hung out. And they're wandering around, and I'm avoiding them like the plague. And he says, when you come back from tonight's mission, I'd like you to talk to these guys and take an interview from them. And I said, well, shoot, I don't know if I'll know what to say. There's a lot of stuff that's going on that we can't talk about. He says, you'll figure it out. And I'm thinking to myself, well, if he thinks I'm coming back, that's a good sign. So I'll do it. So we go through the evening, go into the dark. 11 o'clock, we do our briefing. I didn't have to say anything to these 12 guys because they are 12 crew guys. They all knew what their job was. There's 24 guys. They all knew what they were supposed to do. So it was kind of superfluous, but I finished the briefing and stepped to go to our airplanes. And I get to my airplane, and there's like 6 light alls on the airplane. It was like daylight. and all the media pool guys are there. And I get out and I found the wing commander, and he says, I said to him, I said, you thought you wanted me to talk when we got back from the mission? And he says, yeah, but we thought we'd get you before you left too. And I'm thinking, well, maybe he's not so sure I'm coming back after all. So for about 20, 30 minutes, I have to stand there in front of these guys answering some of the dumbest questions I've ever heard in my life. And I can't answer most of them, but we finally get done with that. And I say, look, I got to go fly now. And I crawl up into the cockpit and left. There's a story behind that too, because Bud Redmond, when I plug in, I can hear myself on the intercom. I can't hear Redmond on his intercom. And I said, is it broke? And he leans over the rail and he shakes his head. Yeah, it's broke. I said, look, Bud, I know my job and I know you know your job, and we're not missing this show. And he gives me a big head nod. So I crank it up. I taxi it out. And about the time we got to the arming area, and I'm listening to him beat around in the cockpit back there. I don't know what he's hammering with, but he finally figures something out, and he connects two wires, and he says, John boy, can you hear me? Yeah, I got you loud and clear, bud. So I think for the rest of the night, I think he's got his finger holding these two wires together. And that's how we went to Baghdad. But then we came back from the mission. The same media guys are there. And so we went through that interview you saw on television. Yeah. And my wife got a lot of problems with that back stateside, too, because the media camped out on our front yard in California.
Oh,
not an interesting time for her.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So Carolyn's got a lot of visitors in front of your house at George.
They were camped out for like a day or two in front of our house. My son was in school, so he was stepping out to go catch the bus in front of our house, and they corner him as he's walking out. And some lady news person said, now that you've seen your dad on television, how are you going to feel if he gets killed? And I'm so proud of my son. He just looked at her and said, get a life, lady. So that was his interview.
They kept walking by her, huh?
Yeah. And frankly, after that, my wife just said, I've had enough. She calls out the base, and the base basically came out, packed her and my son up and moved him out to the base, and they stayed there for about a week.
Oh, perfect.
To stay away from the media pool. Yeah.
Now, I remember when you and I first talked, when we first met, I think you said it was Christian Anandpour who met you at the going out.
Asked me if I was a religious man.
Yes. Sir, are you a religious man? And you came back with the perfect weapons school graduate answer. And that was?
I am tonight.
That was awesome. You know, we didn't have to deal with any of the media at Jeddah. And that was great. When, of course, we had, I think it was 90 tankers on the ramp. We were really busy, and I never once had to talk to the media or even see the media on the ramp.
Yeah.
But, I know that they were pressuring you guys over there.
I'm not real sure why they ended up with us. They were sent to us by Riyadh. It was a media pool. They all went to the same locations together, and they started with us. And I think because we were at the leading edge of the first night. So that's where they wanted the media to start out. And that's how that ended up.
And this was really the first televised war, because Horner gets up that first night and he's reviewing all the different tapes of the stuff that's going on over Baghdad. That really set a precedence, because when we went into Afghanistan in 2001, we would actually collect the tapes at the KAOC. We call it the greatest hits over Kandahar. And we would send it into whoever was briefing. And then, of course, when we went into Baghdad the second time, it was the greatest hits over Baghdad. And of course, the weapons now in 2001 are really accurate. They're really good. And GPS guided weapons are doing all kinds of great things. It was amazing, amazing stuff. But I remember you saying in that CNN tape, well, that's the beauty of the system that you were just explaining about the Wild Weasel. You know, we can stand out here, shoot into them. They can't shoot us. And you said something, I'm going to go get breakfast, get some sleep, and go out and do it again.
I wasn't going to get any sleep. I said I was going to go get breakfast and plan the next one, because that's right. We were back to back on at least 3 or 4 in a row. That was the first one. I don't think I slept for close to 2.5, 3 days to start it off. You're not going to sleep the night before everything kicks off.
No.
The day of, we're all wandering around with the media pool being silly. Then we went into the evening. At least we had meals and stuff. And, we tell jokes and ping pong and whatever we could do to take our mind off stuff. And then we did the mission planning. We stepped to our airplanes and we flew the first night. So I think I was probably up for at least 3 days. And there's something about somewhere around the 48 to 54 hour point, you can't go to sleep anymore. It's like your body just doesn't want to sleep anymore. Then I had to force myself and I had to force other guys, and we had to get ourselves into a rhythm where we could take some crew rest and get some sleep. Peacetime, you have this thing about crew rest because you don't want to crash airplanes. If there's a shooting war going on, all of those rules tend to disappear for a while.
Yep. We were double turning on many days. We'd come back. Our average shorty duration was about 5.5. We'd come back, hop in another jet, 30 minutes later and go back out again just to keep up with all the gas. So, well, about 3 or 4 days later, you and I actually met up again. You had gone into H3 with a whole bunch of F-16s.
I think they were F-15Es.
These were F-16s from Han because they were all named after dogs. That's how I knew they were F-16s. And you know what? That's something I got to tell the audience too. Since you guys had such a unique call sign, we always knew what was coming up behind us. If we heard beer call signs, we knew it was F-4G Wild Weasels. If it was dogs, we knew it was F-16s. If it was oil products, it was F-15Cs. And then the NFL football teams was the F-15E models. The EF-111s were all named after household tools like drill and wrench and things like that. So,
well, the Dalron guys, about a week and a half, 2 weeks into the war, call me up. F-15C guys calls me up and says, "Hey, can we swap call signs with you?" My first thought was, "Hell no, that's my call sign." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, every time you guys come up here, the radars go offline and there's nothing. But whenever we come up here without you guys, they're shooting the crap out of us. We just like to see if we could swap call signs and they settle down a little bit." So I said, "Sure, we can do that." So they took our beer call signs for 1 day. That's all I was going to give up.
Yeah. And
we went up with their Exxon call signs for 1 day. Sure enough, we had a target-rich environment, and nobody was shooting at them, and that worked out pretty well.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah, that's amazing stuff.
So even the Iraqis figured out the beer call sign thing,
and it didn't take them very long, did it? A couple of days later, I remember because I looked it up in that Iron Hand book. I've got that picture I sent to you of the clouds behind the two weasels, and that lead weasel, I come to find out, was you, of all things. And you had gone up there again to H3, which was a huge complex. Because I remember there was like 32 F-16s that were all dropping bombs. But I remember the mission commanders telling the AWACS, "Hey, there's a lot more targets up there. Send more people back up there."
And they were very heavily defended. The ones that we feared the most were the SA-3s, the GOA. There were quite a few of those out there.
Why the SA-3?
For one reason or another, that particular system adapted well to desert ops. The SA-6, which was more recent, it was a newer system. I got the impression it overheated on them, so they had to shut them down a lot. But the SA-3, not only was it more adapted to desert operations, but it had a very intense, very narrow targeting beam, very high-powered targeting beam. It was a deadly system. It was the tornado. You remember the tornadoes that got shot down? Al Taqadum.
Yeah.
It was an SA-3 that got those guys
on that dangerous JP-233 runway seeding mission that they would have to fly level and
stupid weapon.
Oh my gosh.
This is the desert. You don't have to do this.
Yeah.
You go with the equipment that you got. Those guys were in Bahrain with us. They were up at Manama. They had a lot of guts to go low altitude across that runway and do that. A lot of guts. But it cost them at least 2 airplanes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. John Peters ends up on TV. He's all beat up and they're asking him questions, a couple of days later. That was a really crazy thing to do. out in the open desert, flying down a runway at X amount of hundreds of feet, belching those things out. So now,
in some of the earlier planning, some of the B-52 guys, I think when I was in Riyadh, were saying we're going to come in at low altitude and drop our Mark 82s, and I said, why?
Why would you do that when you could do it from 37,000 feet?
Yeah. I mean, we'd be happy to follow you in and make sure nobody's shooting at you. And you're going to be just as accurate from 37,000 feet as you would be from 3,700 feet. And you're not going to get shot at. The bullets are the dangerous part for all of us. Yeah. Bullets are, that's the way I would describe it. It's a mindless missile. Yeah. It has no guidance package to it. It doesn't care what it runs into. And there's so many of them up there, the chances are you could run into one.
Yeah. I remember you describing in the CNN brief after you landed about, the big, what was it, lit up like a Christmas tree over Baghdad.
Well, I knew it was a holiday of some sort. I think I called it Christmas tree, 4th of July. I couldn't make up my mind. It was an exciting fireworks demonstration.
And you could see all that from where you were at, couldn't you?
I had a better seat than the news media did in the Al Rashid Hotel. In fact, I can't remember the name of the what's the guy's name? There was a news media guy. I met him in Los Angeles, and he says, "We know you guys wouldn't bomb the Al Rashid because the media was there." And I'm thinking, no, that's not why you weren't getting bombed. The Al Rashid is so far away from anything of strategic value that there's just no point in bombing the Al Rashid. Yeah. So
that's not why we weren't bombing you. That's hilarious. So, hey, I wanted to ask you, because the Tornadoes were also carrying anti-radiation missiles called Alarm. How successful were they with the Alarm, if you don't mind talking about that?
I don't know enough about the Alarm. I really couldn't tell you one thing or another about it. And if they did that, they didn't do it very often. Mostly they were hard bombing it. We went up on quite a few missions, and all they were carrying was Mark 82s.
Big bombs. Yeah, big bombs. When you guys moved from George to the Middle East, I remember you telling me about how long that mission was. And if I remember right, you didn't know where you guys were going yet.
We staged from George Air Force Base on the West Coast to Seymour Johnson Air Force Base on the East Coast, waited there for about 4 or 5 days for our turn because the tankers had to set up a flow. They got some fighter squadrons moving. I think the F-15s, the F-15Es out of Seymour Johnson went before we got there. They were probably 4 or 5 days ahead of us. They went over to, where'd they end up?
Thumrait.
Not in the UAE. This was the
Thumrait in Oman.
Thumrait. It was
Thumrait in Oman.
Thumrait. That's where they went. So we had the entire ramp and the base to ourselves when we got there. And I filled up the ramp with my 24 and another 8 spare airplanes at Seymour Johnson. We sat there and we waited. Okay, your turn to go. In that period, 4 or 5 days, they talked about sending us to Sharjah, to Dhahran, to Doha, and all of these places. Every time they'd mention a place, I'd have to go look it up, figure out where it is, because I'd never heard of any of them. Yeah. Middle East had not been on my radar forever, so I was not familiar with any of the places. But then finally, they gave us our brief, and they said, you're going east, and then we're sending you to a place called Sheikh Isa. Where's that? In Bahrain. Where's that? This is in the briefing before we go step to the airplanes. And can you tell me anything about this airport? And they said, no, we don't have anything on it. Oh. So I step to the airplane, I crawl up in the cockpit, and just as I sit down, the intel guy comes racing to me, and he says, look, I got a satellite photo of the airbase you're going to, Sheikh Isa. And he hands me this satellite photo, and okay, it's a nice big long runway apparently. Yeah. How long is the runway? He says, we don't know. Okay. What kind of frequencies do they have there? We don't know. Any approach aids? We don't know. Okay, guys, I got everybody on the radio, and I said, look, we're going to a place called Sheikh Isa. We don't know anything about it, but at least we're armed. And we can either fight our way in or protect ourselves as we get there. So everybody's clued in. And I said, look, I'll be the first guy on the ground. And from that point on, I'll be the tower controller for everybody that comes after me. So we take off out of Seymour Johnson. We hit our first tanker somewhere over New Jersey, come across that northern route there.
Yeah, Nova Scotia, up by Greenland, Reykjavik.
We're headed down, actually a little bit further south than that, because we're going through Gibraltar. We hooked up with the tankers out of Pease, and then they take us mid-ocean, join up with the tankers out of Mildenhall. And then the Mildenhall guys hand us off just about the time we're getting to the Straits of Gibraltar, which is when the sun goes down behind us. So now we're into the dark, refueling through the Mediterranean. We meet up with one more set of tankers just before we get to Cairo, and stay with them all the way through Egypt and most of the way across Saudi Arabia. 15 and a half hours, a total of, I think it was 21 in-flight refuels, mostly because, mid-ocean, you stay on the boom a lot just to stay topped off. You don't want to be too far from land without enough gas. And I was really proud because out of 24 airplanes, which was what the goal was, to get 24 airplanes all the way, we only had 2 mechanical issues. One dropped into the Azores, one dropped into Sardinia. I had to put a chase on each one of those. And all the rest of us, 20 intact F4s made it all the way to Sheikh Isa. And by the way, I get overhead the airport, looking at it below me, and I'm just about to make a turn to downwind. And I'm thinking, well, the runway's long enough. And the guy comes up on guard and he says, hey, F4 is over Sheikh Isa, come up my frequency. So I swing over to guard. I said, okay, what's your frequency? And he gives me a frequency. I change over to that, and we basically land straight in. This was a big, long 10,000-foot runway. It was so new that legitimately all I could see were about 6 tire marks on the runway in front of me when I landed. Wow. I think maybe there had been 3 airplanes that landed there ahead of me, maybe more, but that's all I saw. So it was that new. It had just opened up. It was a Bahraini Air Force Base, beautiful facility. We pulled it over to their main ramp, started parking airplanes, putting sandbags under the tires because we didn't have chocks. And it was hot. And it was over 100 degrees and humidity was about 95%. We were pretty tired.
You land there at sometime in August, right?
That was August the 17th.
August the 17th. As John Boy turns and looks at his piece of wood back there. Awesome. Yeah. In August, it's like 100 degrees, 105 degrees. And of course, you're on the ramp. So that adds like 15 degrees. When you guys get out of the airplanes. Okay. You land there during the daytime though, right? You flew through the night and you end up landing like early morning or something like that.
We got there about 2:00 in the afternoon.
Oh, okay.
I told you the sun came up or it went down behind us when we went through Gibraltar. Well, the sun came up in my face when we hit Cairo. And that was the shortest night I can ever remember because we're headed into the rotation of the sun. The time from Gibraltar to get to Cairo when you're flying, in fact, we're flying behind a tanker all the way. Yeah. Nighttime was a very quick nighttime for me. And then we went south down the Nile, took a left at Luxor, went straight across Saudi Arabia. The last tanker guide drug us as far as he felt comfortable. And I said, if you can find out a frequency or anything about this airport before you drop off, please do that. And he worked for probably an hour and a half trying to get some information on Sheikh Isa and never could get it. And he just said, sorry, partner, couldn't help you.
Just fly to a waypoint, huh?
Well, we knew where it was. Bahrain is not a very big island. It's about the size of Manhattan. Yeah. And this was a big, long runway that was on the southern end. That much we did know. And it was a beautiful, clear day, and we could see the island. And we knew where the airport was, so we headed down south. The northern third of the island is all that's populated. There is nothing in the southern 2/3 of Bahrain. Oh, yeah. That's all desert down there. So this airport's all out there by itself.
15 and a half hours in a fighter jet in an F4 ejection seat. That's got to be painful, George.
Yeah. Nobody to give us coffee or...
No boom operator to hand you a cup of water.
Nothing like that.
Oh yeah. That was one of the great things about in the tanker. We had the galley, we could heat up coffee. I'm not a coffee drinker, but the KC-10 was worse, George. It has a full kitchen in it. Guys are eating. They're actually making pizzas in the KC-10 in their galley. They got a full up galley on the airplane.
That's just wrong.
I know. That's why we call it the Gucci bird. The Gucci bird is the KC-10.
That's just wrong.
And think about this, George. The first 3 KC-10s just went to the boneyard.
The first 3, is that right?
Yeah, the first 3. The very first one that came off the assembly line landed last week at Wright-Patterson to be input into the Air Force Museum. And 3 of them went.
What are they replacing them with? Did they ever make that contract work?
They're trying to make it work. The KC-46 is what they're going to try and replace it with. As you know, the KC-46 has not had a good track record.
They were going to do the Airbus, I thought, for a while there.
It won the initial contract. And then Boeing protested and recompeted, and Boeing won. And
that's because they probably didn't compete the first time, thinking, well, we're a shoe-in for it.
You know what, George? I'll tell you something, and a lot of people know this. I got to brief Northrop Grumman EADS, who was going to make the Airbus tanker, and I got to brief Boeing on the Second Gulf War and all the air refueling. I was the chief of the air refueling control team for that war. I knew the vice presidents at both EADS, Northrop Grumman. They were both generals I had worked for. And then the general at Boeing was the guy who signed the check to create the KC-135 weapons school. And they asked me to come up to Roslyn and brief them. And I had 8 slides, and literally all I did was change the name from Northrop Grumman EADS to Boeing when I briefed Boeing. And I briefed Boeing after I had briefed EADS. I was on my feet for 6 hours both times, telling them, here's what this new tanker's got to be. George, I just talked to the squadron commander of the Altus schoolhouse. They have networked the tankers now. The squadron commander told me of an incident that they had during a recent red flag where the tanker was calling out a threat to the package coming from low and behind them, because they have it on a display in the tanker, in the KC-46, from the AWACS, from the rivet joint, from all the other assets that are feeding into Link 16, real-time information, intelligence in the cockpit, all these different things. It's really cosmic what they have done with the tanker, which is exactly what I told these guys, both EADS, Northrop Grumman, and Boeing. You have to network the tanker. We're everywhere. If I can send you information in your Weasel from my KC-135 that some AWACS or RJ is getting from across the country, then that helps you out. And that was one of the things I told them. And sure enough, they're proving that now. They've got a few bugs they got to fix with the KC-46. Boeing's working on that. I have no doubt it'll be a great, great airplane. They just broke an AMC record. They kept one up for 24 hours last week with a whole bunch of pilots on board and refueling it, obviously. So it'll be a great airplane once they get all these bugs worked out. I have no doubt.
They got any hard points on the wing?
No,
you could put a couple of arms on there.
Well, you know what? It's funny you should say that, because somebody asked me about that one day. Why don't we put AMRAAMs on the tankers or harms or something like that? There's plenty of room out on the wingtips to do that. Because if you've seen the new Navy maritime patrol airplane, the P-8 Poseidon, it's a 737 with 4 hard points on both sides that they can carry cruise missiles or they can carry harpoons.
Yes.
And it's got a center weapons bay too. I told everybody that came up with that idea, no. We have one mission set, actually 3 now. We have 3 mission sets that we do very well: refueling, moving people, and then the aeromedical thing that we do also in the tanker, because we can bring guys straight home, load the airplane up with 180,000 pounds of gas. We can fly from Afghanistan all the way back to the East Coast in an R model, which we've done several times now with guys that have gotten banged up over in the Gulf.
Well, as long range as some of our offensive weaponry is, I would think that an ability to self-protect might be an idea sometime in the future.
And maybe it is. It's shaping up that we're going to have another competition here pretty soon for another round of tankers. The first one is 179. Guard unit at Pease has them. McConnell is getting them all. There's been other bases that have been announced. We'll see what happens. I have no doubt Boeing and their smart people will figure this out. whatever's wrong with the remote vision system and these other things. Right now it's got a bad history, but it's going to be able to do some really great things once they get all these bugs worked out. It'll be a great tanker. So tell us what it was like flying with the Swiss.
They have a lot of neat toys. The F-18, chief among them, they had 34, they're down to 33 F-18s. I could only fly their two-seaters because they never trust a foreigner to fly alone in their country. I did get to fly the F-18. I flew their F-5. Also, the Hawk is a jet trainer. And they have this thing called PC-7 and PC-9. The PC-9 is essentially our JPATS airplane, the T-6, the Texan. That was a fun thing to fly. A very special little airplane. And my last flight in Switzerland, one of the brigadier generals invited me to come over to an airport that's in the middle of Switzerland. He says, come on over here and meet me for lunch. So I go over there, and he has a flight suit waiting for me. And so I put it on. And we go out to a PC-9, and he flies me over to San Moritz for lunch. That was special. And I thought that's all we were going to do. But after that, we gassed up. And after that, we flew the entire perimeter of Switzerland one last time in the PC-9 just to see the country from the air one last time. Yeah. So, and that was a border flight all the way around the entire country. My time over there with the Swiss was special. I really had a great time.
Explain to everybody what you were doing over there.
I was defense attaché. I was an air attaché, and then the defense attaché that was there when I got there, he retired early, so I was left alone and I kind of preferred having somebody else around there too. I was kind of alone there for about a year and a half. And then the other Army guy comes in. And so we shared the duties. He was the Army. I was the air attaché.
Explain what air attaché duties are, other than just going around with brigadier generals flying around the country. Well, you get involved in a lot of really interesting things as an air attaché. We're
mil reps to the country. We represent the United States Air Force, the United States military in theater, and we give advice, we give information, we share information. They tell us stuff about their capabilities, we tell them stuff about our capabilities. They always want more. They want more give than take. They want to get more than they want to give. We develop a really fine relationship with them. They've got a lot of really good attitudes about what they can do with their military. And during the Bosnia thing, this was towards the end of the 90s, Switzerland had not been involved in anything outside their own country to do with military for, I think, since the 1830s. Wow. And I managed to convince them, it didn't take much to convince them, but they have these Super Puma helicopters. There was a requirement to bring people out of Bosnia and evacuate them down into Albania. I convinced them that they had the perfect airplane in the Super Puma to do something like that, and convinced the Minister of Defense that it was a good idea. And he says, well, you guys, you Super Puma pilots, you can do this, but you will not take weapons. And I said, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. They were loaded for bear when they went down there. They didn't need to be because they were already well protected, but they went down there fairly well armed, and they did a lot of evacuation stuff. But that's the first time that I know of since the 1830s that the Swiss actually had their military operate outside, except for the Vatican. Their military operates outside only in the Vatican. They protect the Pope.
Amazing stuff. That would have been an amazing assignment. That's your last assignment in the Air Force.
That was my last. Well, it was my last one. My last one, because my son was still in college, and I wanted to make sure that I had an income for as long as he was in college.
Yeah.
So I accepted an assignment back to the Pentagon for my last year and a half. And I was going to be a chief of staff for senior guy in the Defense Intelligence Agency. And then I found out that the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, a 3-star admiral, was starting up a study to find out whatever happened to Michael Scott Spiker, who was an F-15 guy shot down the first night of Desert Storm. And nobody ever accounted for him. And I knew about this because that was our night. That was that night. Yeah. And I knew that he was shot down and missing, and nobody ever said whether actually they called him killed in action. That night they said he's KIA, but nobody ever found the body or accounted for him. So I immediately asked my boss if I could go ask the 3-star if I could have the job, run the study. And he says, how come? And he says, because I was there. And he says, sure, go ahead then. So he put me in charge of it. So that was my job for a year and a half. All of these 17 different intel organizations that they always talk about, I had one from every one of them working for me. We did a lot to kind of track down whatever happened to Michael Scott Spiker.
So did they find his remains while you were working on this project?
Well, actually, what we did prove, at least to the satisfaction of the Secretary of the Navy, was that he was still alive in 97, somewhere in prison, somewhere in Iraq. So they changed his status from KIA to MIA. And as you know, in the military, that automatically gives you all the back pay and allowances for the family's sake. And all the benefits went to the wife and children. So that was a big deal. I didn't find out until 2003, I think it was, that they did find his remains, and that was post-second Iraq War.
Yeah.
Some guy volunteered, they said, here's a reward if somebody will help us find Michael Scott Spiker. And some guy says, well, I know where he is. And so they took him to a grave site, and they dug up some bones. And Mike Spiker was adopted. So doing the DNA thing was a little difficult, but they did mitochondrial with his children and proved that it was him. And so they brought the remains back.
So he was buried somewhere out in the desert?
He was buried outside of Baghdad, somewhere in the neighborhood of the Abu Ghraib prison.
Oh, isn't that fascinating?
They found him.
Yeah, he got shot down by a MiG-25. That MiG-25
Actually,
go ahead.
We never could figure out how he did get shot down. He was in an area west of Baghdad, about 126 miles west of Baghdad, where it could have been, he was in range for one of the surface-to-air missile sites out there. He was in range to a number of different air threats, but none were ever identified as a possible. It could have been friendly fire.
Yeah.
But we never could
prove it. There's a lot going on that night.
It could have been, but I choose to believe it wasn't friendly fire. So who knows? All I do know is they found the airplane. They actually tried to cover it up in 93, 94. They went out there in the desert with permission to the crash site. It took them 3 or 4 months to get permission. And in the meantime, they were basically cleaning up the desert in the vicinity of the crash site. And then when the team gets out there and they look around, they actually found the ejection seat that the Iraqis had not found. It was about a half mile away from the crash site. So they did find the F-18 crash, or the ejection seat there in the desert. And so fairly obviously it was a successful ejection. The following day, they were led to a location where there was a flight suit out in the desert. Look, here's a flight suit. It's all torn up. So obviously the critters got him. This flight suit had not been in the desert that long, and it looked more like box cutter tears than animal tears.
Yeah,
so
there's a big difference between those two.
There was a lot of suspicious stuff that went on back then.
I know that there's been a story that a MiG-25 got him. That MiG-25 pilot was the wing commander at Al-Assad during the second Gulf War. He got the call sign Rocket 1. He took off one day, did that spiral up maneuver and did the high fast flyer thing. And I remember being on the floor of the KOC, George, watching him do that. He had a 1,245 knot ground speed. Giddy up.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
That's a honking airplane.
I understand when it does that, they have to change the motors out because the motors aren't real good on that airplane. We've come to the end here. This has been great to have you on, John Boy. Thanks for being with us on the Lessons from the Cockpit show, spending time with us today about the Weasel mission and about how you and I came together on a particular night on the food desert.
Thank you, Sluggo. I appreciate it. Thanks for the invite.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Lessons from the Cockpit as we talk to Colonel George John Boy Walton and the Wild Weasel mission. During Vietnam, the Wild Weasel mission was created. 50% of the air crews were shot down, killed, or taken prisoner doing this most incredible but extremely dangerous mission. But the F-4G Wild Weasel and the high-speed anti-radiation missile, once married together, created a lethal system for destroying surface-to-air missile sites, or SAM sites. Thanks once again to Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or a hangar, for sponsoring this episode of the show. Beginning in mid-June, folks, I'm doing a 7-part series on a particular battle that I was a participant in, and I've interviewed 6 other people. You're going to hear from 7 people involved in one of the most intense battles in modern history. And there was some casualties and some loss of life. On next week's show, we're going to learn about the A-10 Warthog from somebody who flew them in combat. Please share these episodes with your friends and loved ones, which can be found at my website, markhasera.com, under the podcast pull-down box. Thanks for listening to this episode, and we'll talk to you next week on the Lessons from the Cockpit show.